Hello and welcome to session 2 of Decolonising the Body, part of the 2021 Decolonial Summer School programme. So in the first session we introduced the idea of the decolonial. We spoke about what it might mean to us, what sort of questions we thought it raised, and why this might be an important conversation to be having at this time. In this session we'll move to asking how and why the body might be an important and indeed useful place for us to develop some of our ideas about the decolonial. So there's obviously a lot to be said about the body, and we'll say much more in coming weeks. But let's start with a little bit of a background. And one place to start might be the double problem within Western philosophical approaches to the body traditionally. On the one hand, from the European Enlightenment on, we have an idea of the mind-body split, a dualism, in much the same way as there's a representation of a duality between culture on the one hand and nature on the other. Within this split, the emphasis for Enlightenment thinkers was on the importance of the mind as the place for reason and for thinking. And so the project within science, within politics, within philosophy, was one of freeing oneself from one's body and focusing on trying to identify abstract, objective, universal truths through processes of rational thinking. This idea of duality between mind and body is sometimes referred to as Cartesianism because it's linked to the work of the 16th century French philosopher René Descartes. But you can see it at the foundation of many of our modern institutions and many of our modern disciplines of knowledge. So within our legal institutions, within our political structures and systems, within our ideas of science and philosophy. The problem with this is that alongside this desire to free oneself from one's body and to focus on rationality, only certain types of individuals are assumed capable of this. So on the one hand, we might see, for example, the ways in which women are represented as less capable of rationality due to their association with emotion, their fixedness through their bodies as a result of their role in reproduction. We might also think about how during the colonial project we see various descriptions of racialized and colonized peoples also deemed incapable of rationality, also defined by their bodies. Even in Europe, we see, for example, the working classes identified as also not capable of this abstract rational thinking, if not inherently incapable, made incapable by the fact that they are defined by the labor of their bodies. And so actually, while we have this assertion of universal objective knowledge, what actually becomes clear is that this is a type of knowledge that is only produced by a certain type of subject, namely white European middle-class men. Funnily enough, this gets resisted throughout history in various forms by different people in different places and times. From the 20th century on, we see the development of really rich bodies of theory, Feminist theory, critical race theory, post-colonial, indigenous theory, post-structuralism, postmodernism, all pushing back at this idea of abstract, objective, rational truth, and all urging for a recognition of the ways in which knowledge is always embodied. So meaning that it is always located, it is always partial, it's based on the particular perspectives and experiences of those involved in the process of producing this knowledge, and inevitably also has certain blind spots. This has led some groups like standpoint theorists to argue that what we should be doing is placing much more interest and attention on the perspectives and knowledges of marginalized and oppressed groups within society who, as a result of their position, have a unique perspective that we haven't been able to incorporate so far. At the same time as recognizing the kind of embodied nature of knowledge, these different bodies of theory have also raised questions of power. So another part of the European Enlightenment project was an emphasis on freedom and autonomy, the autonomy of the individual. But again, as we saw with the ideas about who could be freed from their bodies to produce rational knowledge, so too only certain types of bodies were assumed capable of that autonomy, or even worthy of that autonomy. And so this raises important questions about how can we think about individual freedom and the possibilities for human agency within these structures of power that have led to certain groups being dominated and located outside of the possibility of producing knowledge and producing ideas. So in this idea of bringing back the body, we also are faced with important questions about whether or not we can identify the body as something that is just existing naturally in some sort of state as fixed and universal, or whether actually we should be thinking about the ways in which the body is always being acted on and shaped by history, culture, society. And in that process, how are bodies also sites for the production of social control and also possibly sites of resistance of those forms of social control? So a really important thinker in this area who's influenced many of us subsequently is Michel Foucault, the French philosopher. So for Foucault, what he argued was that we need to stop thinking of power as this thing that is opposed from above down on us in the form of oppression. That actually power within modern society operates in a much more nuanced way than that quite often. So while there may still be oppressive forms of power, actually we should also be recognizing the way in which power is being exercised on us all the time in ways that are productive. So for example, in the production of healthy bodies or sane bodies, productive bodies, happy bodies, that all of these processes through the different institutions in society are also manifestations of power, that they are also forms of regulation and disciplining of us. This is, I think, an important insight because it helps us to think about the ways in which our bodies tell us something about how power operates in society, but also raises questions about what are the ways in which we resist that power, maybe through pleasure and practices of pleasure, through creativity and through connection with each other. And so this idea of bodies as both sites of regulation and also possible sites of resistance opens up really important and interesting questions about how we might think about power in our societies. At the same time, there's also been a questioning of whether or not we want to think of bodies as something fixed, as the boundaries being fixed. So as I just said before, we might think about the ways in which through history and through different cultures and societies that actually bodies have been identified, represented, experienced differently. And at the same time that even within our current society, that maybe rather than thinking of our bodies as just being, we should rather be thinking about our bodies as always in a state of becoming. That they're always a bit fluid, they're always in flux, and that they're actually formed through different points of contact and connection with other bodies in the world. And that's not just human bodies. So some of these ideas, which again we'll refer back to over the coming weeks, help us to think about how we might ask some really foundational questions of what the body is and how the body might be an important part of any decolonial project. For example, we might think about whether we want to call into question the fixedness or naturalness or universalness of bodies. How do we think about how the boundaries of the body are demarcated, blurred, or reconfigured? How do we think about the role that the body plays in social theory, but also in social and political practice? And how might the focus on the body help us to think about the operation of power, both in terms of how we might be being dominated and regulated, but also where might be possible sites for resistance and agency and freedom? So with these questions in mind, I look forward to a really interesting discussion in our session for this week. Thank you.